Hello and welcome to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. This is your host, Ashley from Ashley Taylor Wellness. On this podcast, we talk about all things beauty, health, wellness, and optimization. Being a high maintenance hippie represents not being boxed in, as I strongly believe that one size does not fit all. I'm a nurse turned coach, and I have learned so much about both conventional and alternative options, and I want to help you expand your options. I'm here to inspire you to learn new ways to improve your quality of life and to take your power back. I'm so excited that you're here, so let's get started. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick update. The episode that you're about to listen to that I recorded with Josh Trent was actually the very first podcast episode that I recorded before any solo episodes or anything. And he's such an amazing person and such an amazing guest. So it was truly an honor. And I wanted to give an update about my personal situation. So several times in the episode, I referenced my former partner. And this episode was after the separation, but before it was announced publicly. And in couples therapy and in figuring things out, I have been advised to heal and handle this privately, which is not usually my style. But I didn't want to edit out what we talked about in the episode. And one spoiler alert, Josh mentioned no contact. And I don't know how I reacted to it. I don't remember. But I now see why that is appropriate. And in the moment, I remember just being like, really? Do we need to? So at this present moment, my personal life as far as my love life and that healing process is something that I'm handling privately. And when I'm ready to share more, I will. So I just wanted to mention that and just give you the real conversation that we had in that moment. And I'll give you more updates whenever it feels right. So I hope you enjoy, and he's an amazing guest. Hello and welcome to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast, where we talk about all things beauty, health and wellness, and optimization. And I'm very excited for my guest today, Josh Trent. And I first saw Josh at Paleo FX in 2022 speaking, and I really resonated with everything that he had to say. And I knew that we needed to connect. So this is our first time speaking in real life, well, virtually. And I'm very excited to have Josh on. So thank you for being here.
Yes, Ashley, people don't know I'm number one. This is amazing.
Yes.
Number one.
This is the
My
first
ego
recording.
is totally tripping out on that.
Yes, the first recording for the podcast, and I'm so grateful. And so just to start, could you give our listeners a little background about you and what you do today?
Well, for 10 years, I was a trainer in the fitness industry. And I started to get really burnt out because I was just shining light on other people. But, you know, when you hold the flashlight, the other side of the flashlight stays dark. And so that's what I was doing. It's what a lot of people in yoga and wellness and fitness do in general, which is like really be of service to others, because it's a perfect mask to not be of service to themselves, the scariest parts of themselves. So that took me on this big journey when I left fitness of going to corporate America, committing spiritual suicide, and then eventually having a come to Jesus moment, a real dark night of the soul moment in 2014 that sparked me to either not be here on the planet anymore or do something that I really cared about. And at the time, that was speaking, that was podcasting, that was like almost 9 years ago now. It used to be the Wellness Force radio podcast back in the day. Now it's Wellness and Wisdom. And so what I do right now is I hold really beautiful, conscious conversations that actually make people feel something different about their lives or think differently about their lives. And I do it through these 5 aspects of the wellness pentagon, which is what I teach in my breathwork program. I founded breathwork.io, which is Breathe, Breath, and Wellness. I've been doing that since 2016. And then one aspect of that is the physical. And in this pentagon that I mentioned earlier, it's the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and financial ways that we nourish ourselves, that we know ourselves, and that we can actually be there for other people. But a lot of times I found that in my journey specifically, I can look back with compassion and say, wow, man, you really did the best you could with the consciousness that you had at that time. But quite frankly, I really had no business being of service to other people when I hadn't tended to the parts of myself that needed the exact service I was pretending to give to others. And so now I'm like 42 years old. I'm at a place where, you know, I have my second baby on the way, and I've gone through enough beatings in life, enough dark nights of the soul, Ashley, that I can really truly feel like I'm of service to people that are maybe at the beginning of their spiritual journey, and understanding like this big question that I've always asked myself since my whole life, actually, but especially since 2015. And that is, how do I live my life well? What does that actually mean to live your life well? What is wellness? And that's just this constantly unfolding evolution of my understanding, not only in myself, but in all my guests and in the people that I respect and learn from too. So that's me in a really tiny nutshell. There's a heck of a lot more, but that's like a good starting place.
That's amazing. So 2014 is when you had this moment that it sounds like it was very challenging for you. You were going to go in a couple different directions. Are you open to sharing a little bit about what you mean by spiritual suicide?
Yeah. Spiritual suicide is what, unfortunately, if I had to put a percentage on it, 99% of the people in the world are doing right now in this moment. And spiritual suicide is when you have that inner voice, you have that intuitive self inside of you that is sometimes whispering, but a lot of times screaming for what you actually are meant to be doing, but it's pushed down by the responsibilities and honestly the stories of fear that we tell ourselves as to why we can't do exactly what it is that our soul is called to do. And so spiritual suicide is when you literally kill your soul by doing something that is completely misaligned with the voice of that soul, with the intuition of that soul. Mm-hmm. And so that's was my world for quite some time. And, you know, I can have compassion for myself and also for all of us that are in that 98, 99%, because geez, our whole world where you and I actually met on Instagram, like all of these tools and artificial intelligence and technology and just the world in general, it is designed, it is actually made to harness people that are suffering from spiritual suicide and monetize their suffering. And so I don't hold it against people. I'm not sitting on a mountain and being like, I'm so cool. No, I've had to earn where I am right now. I've had to like cry and bleed and blow snot bubbles and ceremonies and all kinds of stuff to get here. So it's not a judgment to your question, the spiritual suicide, what actually is spiritual suicide. If I had to encapsulate it, I would say that spiritual suicide is when you consciously or unconsciously ignore the intuitive voice that is inside of you. And it is telling you exactly what you're meant to do. And there are stages of courage development that one has to encounter in order to actually have the courage to listen to that voice and then have the courage to act upon an inspired place from that voice. There's a lot there, but spiritual suicide is rampant. I would say that most people, even if they're super wealthy, they are probably still committing spiritual.
Yes, that really, really speaks to me. I don't know how much you know about my background, but I've been a nurse since 2013. And I thought that that would be the best way to help people. I was a high school dropout, so I would now have my ego needs met. I'm this board certified nurse, but I was truly committing spiritual suicide because my soul was like, I don't really believe in the things that we're doing for people. But what kept me there was fear, exactly like you said.
Yeah.
And I was tethered in by $175,000 of student loans. And I think a lot of people, as I've shared my story since 2020, there's so many nurses, doctors, medical professionals, people who want to help people, but they are suffering themselves. And so how much are you going to be able to help someone if you're running on fumes, running around like a chicken with your head cut off, and you don't really believe in the work you're doing? So definitely can relate to that. And that fear keeps us stuck. It really does.
It keeps us stuck by design. I actually feel like that's part of God knowing God's self. Mm-hmm. And since this is the high maintenance hippie podcast, like maybe a good thing to talk about would be this concept of the self, because I think what a lot of hippies in the 60s and 70s really wanted was they wanted to go outside of the subjective self and they wanted to be in the objective, or they wanted to be in the observer. But you can't just do that like it's a light switch. In order to really have a touch point or to have an essence of what it means to be an observer, you have to be willing to go through all the skin peeling and removal of layers that the mind and really the construct of society and parents have taught us about what the self actually is. Like, to be objective or to be a hippie is to really, like, it's not just about free love and, you know, like lots of drugs and experimentation. Like, hippies get a bad rap, but what hippies did right, and I think what hippies got right, is that we are one. You know, there is this universal law of one. And every single time that I can speak in my own life that I go against that law, that I forget, or that I get angry, or that I think I'm separate than Ashley, or Ashley separate than me, then all that does is just bring me suffering. It brings me different chasms of pain. And so I think what the hippies got right was that, yes, we are one, but also here in the 3D world, there's a way to practically apply that kind of knowledge. And it starts at the ground level of like, know thyself. Like, who actually am I? What am I here to do in this world? It could be spiritual. It could be scientific. It doesn't matter who you are or what you do for a living or what your soul is calling you to do. You could be a nurse or a doctor or a podcaster or a massage therapist. It's all good. Like, whatever you choose. Everyone's got their own unique path. And I think the more that we can start to identify with the objective self, instead of just be so subjective with each other all the time, which just creates rifts in our society, maybe there is some wisdom that we can learn from the hippies. You know, maybe they did get some of the things right. They didn't get it all right, but they did get that part right. And I think that's worth talking about.
So what do you think it was that helped you get past that fear?
Oh, well, I still experience it all the time.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if that fear ever goes away.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it goes. Like, I've been on stages with some amazing people at the top of the food chain in our wellness world, and I kind of feel it from them too backstage. It's like, as much as people front, or as much as people say that they're comfortable facing their fear, I think the whole thing about fear is that it's supposed to be uncomfortable. And it's supposed to be either false evidence appearing real or forget everything and run. But I actually think it's different. I haven't talked about this in a long time, so this is really cool. You asked me, how did I get through the fear, or how did I overcome the fear? I think really what fear is, for everyone's attention responsibly. That's what I think. I think it's about for everyone's attention responsibly, because wherever you and I put our attention, it's going to put our energy towards that experience. So if I have an experience of, oh my God, like, let's just say, for example, somebody's listening and they're like about to go on their first date, and they're going on their first date and they're like, oh my God, this girl's totally beautiful. Like, am I man enough to be with her? And blah, blah, blah. You could put your focus on that, and you could start allowing yourself to feel and experience that fear. Or you could just say, all right, I'm not that fear. I'm not these thoughts. I'm literally just the arbiter of these things. And you can choose to not identify with the thoughts that you're feeling. Well, that's the same way that I do it in my life. Some days I'm really good. Like, I feel the fear and I do it anyways. Some days I feel the fear and I might not do it as strong, or I might not do it as grand, but I still do it. And I think that's the thing, is like, people try to say, and especially in our spiritual community, they'll say things like, oh, if it feels good, do it, brother. You know, go with your highest excitement. Like, you know, if there's resistance, then, you know, you're meant for a different path. It's like, I call bullshit on all of that. Yeah. I actually think that the only way I've been able to achieve any limited success, or any success in the future, is if I go to the path of resistance, is if I actually go in that direction and I face all the fear and honestly all the bullshit stories about myself that are just wanting healing and wanting forgiveness that come up. That's the real reason that I can overcome, back to your question, the fear. How do you overcome the fear? You just acknowledge that the fear is there, and you experience it for all that it is, and you don't allow it. You consciously do not allow the fear to control you, but you have to develop, and this is what we talked about earlier, you have to develop the courage in order to do so. Like, knowing and then doing are two separate things. I can know that the things I'm sharing with you about fear are true, but then when it comes down to the moment and I'm getting those catecholamines of hormones and I'm feeling my cortisol rise up and I'm in that shit storm or whatever it is where I'm super afraid to do something, those are actually the micro traumas or the micro adversities that build my courage. And I think the only way you can have that is through life experience. I don't think there's a shortcut for that.
Beautiful.
There's no 5-step guide.
Well, resilience is one of the things that I focus on in coaching. Mental and physical resilience is what I focus on helping my clients cultivate, because resilience is a skill, confidence is a skill. And in my own personal experience, I don't think that the fear goes away. We just identify it. You know, even this morning, I had some fear come up because I'm stepping outside of my comfort zone and doing something new and starting a podcast. And in that moment, I decided I have one of two options. I can let the fear shut me down, or I can do exactly what you said. I see the fear and I'm going for it anyway. And I believe that we only fail when we give up. I'm guaranteed to fail if I don't start.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, myself included, see people who we consider to be successful or more established or something like that. So we assume, well, they don't deal with any of these feelings. And just like you mentioned, people on stage that have been doing this for a while, they still go through that. So to hear that makes it more human, and I think gives people permission, which they don't need, by the way, but it gives them permission that they can give themselves to say, you know what, other people deal with this. It's part of the process to success. It doesn't mean it's not possible. That's what I have to go through. And it makes us stronger every time we do it.
There's this one side of the equation that says life should be in flow, life should be this way. And then there's this other side of the equation that I've really learned through my own life experience. And that is that there are going to be times where you want to quit so bad. But then you have to take a deep breath. And this is what I teach with all my students and that I do on the daily is if I can breathe, then I can choose. If I can breathe, I can choose. And it's something that I've been telling myself as a mantra for a long time, because what is it, Ashley? And you know this from working in the nursing industry and working with clients, most likely when people are allowing fear to control them, they're not breathing. They're totally stuck in their scalenes and their sternocleidomastoid, and they're just like up here tight. They're not even breathing through their belly. They're not even allowing their 4 diaphragms to move the cerebral spinal fluid. Like, it's just not happening. So energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transmuted. And so, yes, I'm regurgitating that from Einstein, but Einstein learned that from probably some other mentor. All knowledge turns into wisdom eventually if we have the experience, the life experience, and the compassion for it to do so. And so if I can't move energy other than by actually physically moving that energy, then I have to physically move energy in myself to overcome fear. And it could be fear of any of those aspects I talked about. It also could be fear of relationships, fear of intimacy. A lot of people have gone through capital T trauma in relationship, or even just in familial settings like physical abuse, sexual abuse, or there's tons and tons and tons of lowercase t traumas. And that could be like neglect or lack of support or ridiculing. Like, trauma doesn't always have to be a big T. It can sometimes be a lot of little T's. Why am I saying this? The reason is because all of that creates a barrier between our conscious and our unconscious mind. And so the more that I've absorbed other people's stories, AKA trauma, the more that I've believed what other people have told me about me, or the more that I've gone through these big T traumas, like the physical, the sexual, stuff like that, that is to the degree that I have this thick barrier between my conscious and my unconscious. And we know that, like everything in life that occurs, it actually is happening for us, even if it's really, really, really hard. And I want to be cautious with that, because somebody might be watching or listening and they would say, what do you mean, like, my abuse was happening for me? What are you talking about? Well, it happened. And if it wasn't supposed to happen, it wouldn't have happened. So it obviously happened for a loving, learning reason. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened, because God is experiencing God's self in unlimited ways. At least that's the way that we all make sense of it. And so things happen, and so we create meanings as to why they happen, and those meanings have to be, in my experience, they have to be from a place of growth and from humility. Like, my mom was manic bipolar ever since I was young. I never had that safety at home. My dad left home when I was super young. So I was, quote, the broken family. And so I could have taken that and I could have told myself bullshit stories like, I'll be just like my mom. I'll be just like my dad. Oh, we're the Trents, so we have this proclivity, blah, 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 blah. But it's all bullshit. It literally exists in the power of choice that is inside of all of us and you and I right now. And I can feel it in my fingers when I talk to you about it, because to the degree that I'm successful, or that I have a loving relationship with my partner, Carrie Michelle, or that I have my family, or that I have anything in my life, it's, am I willing to actually forgive the people that have traumatized me and have hurt me, so that I do not project that onto her or my family or to you, or to my business or to my podcast guests, a life free from projection is a life totally well lived. That is a great life. That is a life well lived. And that is ultimately, I think, at the core of maybe what even you and I are exploring is like, how do we live life well? And what is this fear thing all about? And why is it here? I honestly think, Ashley, it's here to teach us. I think fear is here to teach us. And I think if we can just be humble as we go through the different waves of fear, then eventually we will become more courageous and more strong. And that's where mostly the gratitude will flow in. I mean, I'm getting like emotional just talking to you about it because, man, that's the only thing that's mattered in my life. The only thing that's mattered is my ability to meet these adversities and this fear with humility. Then that equals gratitude. But I can't ever get to the gratitude if I'm spiritually bypassing, if I'm bullshitting, or if I'm trying to put on some front that I'm somebody different than who I am. You know, there's a lot there.
Yeah. That really speaks to me as well, because in 2021, I left my nursing job. We had the mandate come. I wasn't taking the juice. It wasn't happening.
Congrats.
Thank you. And a lot of people didn't see it that way, and they didn't congratulate me. They were, scared and fearful. And of course, I had those emotions come up, of course, because that was where I felt I would have career stability and be able to help people. And then everything changed. So that at the time was very, very scary. I am so grateful that that happened, because I'm actually allowed to go back to the hospital if I wanted to, and I don't need to anymore. Because of that painful experience, I was forced to make a decision. I either stay here and do something that's not in alignment, or I just go for it. And the year that I left was more financially, soulfully, healthfully fulfilling in every way. But that required me saying no to something that wasn't right for me anymore. And that's really, really hard for people to do in career, relationships, and anything. It's hard to let go. Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it was Top Gun Maverick. Have you seen that movie?
No, I haven't.
All right. For everybody, there's a part in there where they talk about letting go. I just watched it last night with my family. That's why it's like fresh top of mind.
Yeah.
And I saw it in the movie, and I kind of started to cry during the movie, and I'm even feeling it with you right now. Letting go is also a skill. You talked about confidence being a skill and courage being a skill. I would be suffice to say that all human behaviors, or all human, what word am I looking for? All human behaviors and all human abilities to regulate ourselves. Like, emotions are human. Emotions are the body's innate wisdom coming through. But I think that all human behaviors and all ways that we regulate our emotions are the complete and total depiction of the quality of our lives. Absolutely. If I can emotionally regulate myself and know, like, all right, it's actually time to let this thing go. You know, it's time to let this thing go. I don't know exactly why, or maybe I do know exactly why. But if I don't let this thing go, it's going to kill me. It's actually going to kill me. It's going to make me sick, or it's going to hurt me, or it's going to make me broke, or whatever it is. And honestly, those things are really hard. And sometimes for most people, it's actually relationships. That's the big one.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I haven't shared this publicly yet. By the time this comes out, it will be public, but my partner of 5.5 years and I have decided to uncouple in the last 2 weeks. And that is hard. It is hard. Yeah. So the first step was letting go of the career. The second step was letting go of the relationship. And I really admire and respect the relationship that you have with your wife, with your partner. And I do want to ask some questions about that. But going back to letting go, it doesn't have to mean that someone is terrible or that something is so bad. And that's why I think it can be hard to let go. It's easy to let go if you're physically abused, or in some cases it may not even be for some people. But when we choose what is truly our path, it's not easy. And that will require grieving and going through that process. And my audience is 95% women. So I have a lot of women who I've shared, months back, starting over what that's like. And a lot of women say, well, it's easy for you to say because you're in a relationship, but now I will be starting over. And I want to go through that process with as much respect for our time together and gratitude for everything that came out of this relationship. And that's different than how I've handled it in the past. So have you ever been in a relationship prior to your marriage where you had to consciously uncouple, or what has that looked like for you in the past?
Sure, like 5 or 6 times, of course.
Consciously or not so consciously?
Well, I would say that the one before my current was definitely conscious. The times before that were not conscious. And there's so many complex layers to this topic that maybe the best place to start is just the surrender that who you were as a soul expression when you met your partner 5 years ago is a completely different expression now. Mm-hmm. Completely different. The core of you, or as I just interviewed a guy named John Wineland, and he talks about, at least for the masculine energy in the world, that the masculine kind of floats in the moment to moment being, but it's always tethered to this anchor. It's always tethered to this part of self that has never changed. It's the part of myself, or it's the part of yourself that no matter what you've been through, like it's always the part where when you lay on the pillow at night and you take a deep breath and you feel that part of yourself, it's the part of yourself that has never wavered, never changed. So that part never changes from relationship to relationship. But the expression of your soul and your interests and the things that bring you joy and the things that break your heart, there's so much mystery in this question, Ashley. There's so much mystery because I'm sure in your heart of hearts, just like in my heart of hearts, I would have loved if they all worked out. If all of them worked out, and especially after 5 years, you've gone through almost an entire 7-year Saturn return together. So that's a lot. There's a lot there. Mm-hmm. But I would just say that in a conscious way, the only way you can have a conscious uncoupling or a conscious relationship at all is if you have open, authentic communication in a nonviolent way. Mm-hmm. Nonviolent communication, NVC, is a huge tool. In some ways, it's what Harville Hendricks and the Gottmans talk about in all of their work, which is you create a space of listening. You let the partner share. After the partner shares, you ask if they have anything else to share. Then you say, thank you for sharing, and you share back to them what you've heard to get clarity on it. Mm-hmm. And then you have some kind of resolve at the end. You have a space where they feel heard, they feel seen, they feel understood. But it's a skill because in this process, there's a lot of shit that comes up. There's a lot of triggers and woundings and anger and projection. We talked about projection earlier. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of projection that comes up, specifically with men, because who taught us how to be emotionally intelligent? Holy shit.
Many of us.
Yeah. You could say it for women too, but like, yeah. I'm just speaking as a man growing up in East County, La Mesa, like, in the 1990s and 2000s, like our conversation was not normal. Like talking about our feelings and emotions and sharing what was really going on. So there needs to be, I think, in conscious uncoupling or in conscious relationship, there needs to be a really deep commitment, a shared commitment to unpacking each other's things, each other's stuff, each other's projections, slowly and carefully and cautiously. But life doesn't always permit that. Like, for everyone out there that has kids, or if like when you're a parent, your time is literally so minute, like time for yourself, time for self-care. I wish I can go back to when I was single and like scratch my shoulder and be like, you need to really enjoy this because when you have kids, like my calendar is like every little 15 minutes is planned out, and it's worth it. It's totally worth it because beautiful things come from commitment. But also, we have to honor the mystery as to why sometimes these commitments don't work out. People can do their absolute best, and they can cry, and they can purge, and they can grow together. And then at some point, Ashley, I don't know how you feel about this, at some point, there's just a knowing where the two souls have completed their path together. And it's sad, and I think there has to be an honest grieving process about that. Yeah. I will say for true conscious uncoupling to exist, and then I'll pause, is like there needs to actually be a space of no communication. Okay. Because every single time you go back to that person, it's just peeling the Band-Aid off a little bit more. And so that's my advice for anyone that's going through a conscious uncoupling is still practice the nonviolent communication, set healthy boundaries and guidelines around social media, and communication in general, and commit to each other that you will just have a space where there is zero communication. So you can let all the different programs stop and all the different hurt and wounding stop. I mean, conscious relationship is a whole other topic, but that's how I would say people could begin in the conscious uncoupling.
Okay. So for someone who is wanting to create a conscious relationship, well, I guess, are you comfortable sharing how you met your wife?
Sure.
Okay.
Facebook.
Okay.
And actually, we're not technically married. Like
Okay.
I wear a ring. We're spiritually connected.
Okay.
But the construct of marriage is very interesting in America because most people do it because they were told to do it, and the people that told them to do it were told to do it as well. I'm not anti-marriage. I'm actually very pro-marriage for sure. And at some point, if it's in the stars for us to get married, like if we both agree to get married, then we will. But I met her on Facebook. She did a video, and when she was speaking in the video, I was just like, wow, who is this? Like mystic mama. Like she's like this mystical being. And actually, that's still her nickname to this day, is like I call her Mystic Mama. And she actually is a mama now.
Yeah.
But within 3 months of meeting her, I knew we actually did, I think it was MDMA. We did an MDMA ceremony together. And I knew way before we even got to the ceremony that this was the mother of my child. And I'll tell you that, like, for men, it's a timing thing. Not all men are ready, even if it's the most perfect relationship. They're just not ready yet. There's something that hasn't switched inside of them. And I've heard Esther Perel talk about this as well in relationships, that like for women, it's about their awareness of their biology and about their soul expression. For men, it's literally about timing. It's about the timing of their lives when they're ready to commit and have children and take that on, because the masculine thrives in solitude. And so for the masculine to give up solitude, it is a huge sacrifice for us to do so. And so it has to be something that really calls us forward. And sometimes it's hard to even put words on that, Ashley, what calls the masculine forward to commit. It's like it's a feeling. I wish I could say that there's a recipe for it. And maybe there is, right? Shared goals, shared purpose, shared alignment, wanting the same things in life, caring about eating organic food, having an agreement to, when you do have a family in the future, to not put your kids in public school. You know, certain aspects that for me are like an absolute deal breaker. Those were all in alignment. So I think for me personally, like it's been just a lot of challenge and a lot of thresholds in this relationship too. Like it hasn't been all puppy dogs and candy canes. We've definitely met each other at moments where we're like, should we do this anymore? Like, should we actually be in relationship? And it always comes back around to, well, yeah, there's more to learn. There's more to learn and there's more to love. So I'm also 42, about to be 43 this year. And I've been through enough relationships to know that the only common denominator as to why those relationships didn't work out is me. And so it's not to shame myself or to put myself in a little box. It's more just to say, okay, well, I know that I have a tendency towards hypervigilance if provoked. I know that I have some wounding from both mother and father in certain situations. But here's the key everybody's got to hear this. If you really want a conscious relationship, you have to be open and honest about owning your own projections.
Yes.
I own my own projections. It might take some time, but eventually I'll come back around. I'll be like, you know what? I completely projected in that situation. Or my partner will say, you know what? I completely projected in that situation. And when we trace it down, Ashley, what all this is about, it's about 0 through 7 years old, when our brain is hyper malleable and super plastic. And then it's about 7 through 21, where we go through the challenges of life and whether we're supported or not. But our behaviors neuroplastically are literally branded or imprinted from age 7 to 0. And then after 7 up until about 21, from the research I've done, it's really just about unlearning all the shit that you got imprinted on when you were 0 through 7. So hopefully your parents are woke enough, and woke in a good way.
Yes.
There's kind of a dark side of woke.
Yes.
But woke in a good way enough to be awakened to the fact that emotional epigenetics is real. Emotional epigenetics is just like physical epigenetics. Like Chris Kresser said once on the show, he was like, genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger.
Yes.
So it's like you can have a proclivity towards anything, but if you consciously choose to create your environment that's loving, especially in conscious relationships, which is what we're talking about, then you may have to go through a reckoning. You have to go through a reckoning and a dark night of the soul multiple times to kind of puke out or purify yourself of all the stuff that you've learned that has been keeping you out of conscious relationship when you think that maybe it's been your enemy, but it's actually been for the greater good. You just have to be able to harness it and to really get it out of your system. It doesn't have to be through plant medicine. It can be through many things, but that one piece that I shared, like that's the big one. You have to be willing to own your projections, and you have to be willing to identify them and be humble about them too. And the discernment to know when you're not projecting as well. That's all kind of wrapped up in there.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And we are the common denominator in our relationships, because for a long time, I was attracting a certain type of man, but I had to look at who was I entering those, I don't even know, I guess relationships. They weren't very healthy. And it's because I didn't feel very well about myself. And a lot of that came from my upbringing. So we have similar upbringings in the sense that I had young parents, didn't live with them after 5. My dad, I didn't live with after 1. So I was always trying to figure out how to adapt to the world. I didn't really get to learn who I was. I was just trying to, it was survival mode. And so a lot of these stories and beliefs, just like you said, from the first 7 years of life, that a lot of people don't know that. And that's why I am very pro homeschooling and giving your children that love and knowing that they're supported and they don't have to do something to be worthy of love. Maybe to make money or something like that, but not to be worthy of love. And if we did not learn that, many people will seek love or maybe not even love, but affection or things to feel good outside of themselves. For me, it was substances and just being very promiscuous because I was trying to fill something within myself. And then I realized nothing external was going to fill that. It was an inside job. I just didn't really know what that meant. So a big piece of that is realizing I'm the common denominator here. I project so much of my shit onto other people. It's because you're doing this. It's because of you're doing this, not because of something unresolved within me that is resurfacing and it's an opportunity to heal. I don't think many people see it that way. I think a lot do, but that's the shift that I would like to see. It doesn't mean anything bad about us. If we own our shortcomings or our projections, we can actually declare, oh, here I am doing this thing, and then own it. And hopefully we have a partner that isn't going to hold it over our head. We'll be grateful that we're so self-aware and owning that and hold the space so we can grow together. And that's what I think is really important in any partnership. I don't think it is sunshine and roses, but a lot of people think that it is because that's what we see on Instagram. Most people don't record their disagreements or things like that. So I love social media, but I also think it can skew our perception of reality. And the truth is that people do have challenges, but how well we resolve conflicts as a couple is also very important.
Yeah. At the core of all this is something that when I say this, you or everyone, they might view it as a platitude. They might go, oh yeah, we know that, Josh. It's kind of like when someone sees a social media square and it says love is all there is. We go, I know. Yeah. But it's like, what the fuck? Like, are you doing it? So what I'm about to share is the same thing. If my partner and I, and it could be any way, like some people relate man to man, woman to woman, whatever. I relate heterosexually. So if a man, I'll speak from that. If a man and a woman come to an altar of humility and they can just be honest with each other, like truly honest, like take that deep breath and go, okay, outside of all my projections, outside of all my baggage, outside of all the stuff that I'm going through in my life, I'm here with you at this altar of humility. And many times it comes through ceremony for people because that really shuts down the default mode network and it gets people out of their amygdala. So when people go into ceremony and to save ceremony of some kind, they can actually be at that altar of humility. And then this is what I'm going to say that most people would go, oh, we know. If you can be honest with your partner and they can be honest with you, then God will just leave the mystery of the relationship to whether it succeeds or not. If you can just be honest with each other, like really honest, like even about all the stuff you don't want to be honest about, like, like she's like, do you hate my mother? Or do you hate my father? Or, do Do you hate my brother? Like that kind of stuff, like the stuff that people never want to talk about. If you can bring that to the altar of humility and you can turn down the default mode network, I like to do it with breath, or you can turn down the hypervigilance of the amygdala, then you can really get on with it. You can really start living a life together. But anytime that that altar of humility is shadowed by someone's lack of openness, and look, I will say this, like, I don't know the first thing about being a woman. I don't know what it's like to have a man penetrate me. I don't know what it's like to actually be a flower that opens to receive that kind of energy. I don't. Mm-hmm. And it would be silly for me to sit here on your podcast and say that I do. But what I can say that is a woman's power. One of the greatest things about a woman's power is her ability to open and receive a man, but also that man has to be responsible and loving and honest for him to be received in that way. So that's the kind of altar I'm talking about. If a man and a woman can come to that place where she can let go of all her wounding, all her anger towards men, all her anger towards whatever's happened to her, and see it as happening for her, to get her to this place where she finally can open to this man because she trusts that this man, although imperfect, is willing to do the real work to penetrate the deepest essence of her. And I don't just mean physically, like to penetrate the part of her that has been longing for that penetration so she can finally feel full. Man, that's honesty. Like that's the kind of relationship that'll succeed, but it takes work on both sides. It takes honor and humility and honesty on both sides. And not every relationship's like that. Like both a man and a woman have to really agree to do the deepest work and to bleed together. Like I've said that to Carrie. I'm like, we just have to bleed together right now. Like there's no way out of this. Like we're just going to have to bleed together right now. And then the storm's going to pass, because that's the only way that these imprintings and this trauma and honestly, this bullshit goes from generation to generation to generation. The very last thing I'll say, because you got me on a good one here, is that some of my research that I've been doing for a book I'm writing, it's about emotional epigenetics. And there was a study done where rats were traumatized, male rats were traumatized, and they would breed those rats with non-traumatized, totally supported female rats. You know what they found after 5 generations of rats being birthed? In the offspring from that original 5th generation mouse father, that great-great-great-great-grandfather mouse, there was still the hypervigilance and there was still the sympathetic dominance inside of that rat 5 generations later. So how could anyone argue with the fact that you and I are not just Josh and Ashley? We are a byproduct of our great-great-great-grandparents' lives on both sides of our tree, and it is our responsibility to shed all the hormonal processes, all the energetic processes, all the esoteric stuff that happens. There's so much responsibility that you and I have and that we all have if we really want a conscious relationship. This is the reason why most people don't have them, is because there's such an element of the generational pain that has been pushed and transmuted and imprinted onto us. And by the way, this isn't to blame them. Like, for sure. They did the absolute best I'm not sitting here complaining about my grandparents, my great-greats, even my father and my mother. All I'm saying is, like, they did the best they could. It's not our fault. It's like that scene in Good Will Hunting, you know, where he cries.
I haven't seen that one either.
Like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You got to see that movie.
Okay.
Anyways, the point I'm making is, like, we've really got to come to that altar, and we've got to be honest, and we've got to bleed together, because otherwise our children are just going to repeat our shit.
Yes. And I love what you said about the pain. It's never to blame. And I love the saying, what may have happened may not be our fault, but healing is our responsibility. Otherwise, we're going to repeat these cycles, often unconsciously. And people say all the time, I'm turning into my mother or my father, because they don't realize how much came from what they witnessed at that early age. And then when you start to see the patterns, and then we can realize, oh, I have some work to do. But it's so much easier to blame people. But is that really going to get us the relationship and the love and the connection and the life that we want if it's always for somebody else to deal with? Never for us to look at our own reactions. And that's not easy. But I will say, in this relationship, I did have that, where it was safe for me to express. We were so brutally honest in the most loving way possible. And I think that's why we stayed together for so long. It was so refreshing. And in the past, and I know many people put their best foot forward and they want to try to portray someone like their best self. But I find that just being as real as possible from the beginning is what allowed, it felt so free to not have to put up a front and to just have that. And that emotional intimacy is very important as well. And I think that will also deepen the physical intimacy.
I don't think it's possible, at least not at my stage now. It definitely was like, maybe you and I shared this promiscuous behavior where you try to fill. That was definitely my 20s, where I tried to fill a hole inside of me that was really wanting actual substance rather than just temporary reprieve.
Right.
And so, yeah, the only way that we can really get to the bottom of what you're talking about is if we are honest about what we need.
Yes.
But sometimes, like, we just don't even have the emotional intelligence to know what we need. So we just operate from like the head, and we get, you know, the clothes, the women, the men, the cars. We get all the things that we feel might somehow fill that. But really, most of the times, probably what that is like a really solid cry, hugging someone for a long time, or a conversation that lights up your heart. You know, like that's the majority of probably what we want most of the time. But in our 20s, it's seen as weakness, unfortunately, unless you're here and you're in your 20s. Great. You know, more power to you. There's a guy in my men's group that I lead. He's in his 20s, like 24. So it's possible. It's definitely possible to awaken earlier. I wish the learning curve was shorter for people. Maybe that's one thing that somebody can get from this podcast, is like that you actually, the faster you run towards the scary stuff and towards the stuff that makes you cry and towards the stuff that hurts, the less you'll be in pain, actually. But it's a juxtaposition. It's like it doesn't seem that way.
Right.
It doesn't seem that way to the mind.
But that has been true in my personal experience as well. When I choose to just ignore what I'm really feeling, what my soul's really telling me, it will manifest in some way. And in that case, I was covered in full body hives for months because my soul knew something.
Whoa.
I wasn't listening. I even had a dream that the snake was chasing me, and then all my skin a few months later came off.
What was the snake? What was the snake?
I don't know what kind, but it was the snake. It was
No, I mean, like, what did it represent? Oh, it was the hospital.
It was in the hospital. It was in my home. The snake was following me everywhere. And in that dream, I was like, I'm going to kill that fucking snake. And I did. And I've always had running dreams. But in this dream, I was like, not today, snake. And then just something shifted. And it was a really powerful start of a spiritual awakening for me. I used to be completely agnostic, maybe even atheist. I just didn't believe it. And it wasn't something I could force. But as I prayed and I hit that rock bottom, my, I guess, lowest point for you, it was 2014. For me, it was 2018. And I just got on my knees and I cried and I said, God, they say that God won't give you more than you can handle. I don't know how much more I can handle right now, but I can't keep living like this. Show me the steps to take. Give me clarity, discernment, and I will do the work. And then everything changed from there. So it was also me trying to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders, but I wasn't tapping into this amazing resource that is there for all of us, that we're just focused on what's happening on the 3D level, but there's so much more. So I like to live in the 3D world. That's part of our human experience, but there's just so much more that we can't see. And the emotional regulation is so important. And for a lot of people, we didn't learn that. So I'm grateful that that's something you help people learn. I'm teaching my clients and my audience the things that I've learned because no one taught me that. And I don't think kids are learning that in public school. And their parents, not to ever blame them, they did the best they could with what they knew, but we are the cycle breakers. We get to say that dynamic doesn't have to continue anymore. So I'm so inspired by the family that you've created, and just I want other women to know that God does have a plan. Ask for what it is that you want, and what you focus on is what you're going to bring into your life. So if you think that all men are insert negative thing, that's what you're going to find. And over the last several years, I found so many amazing, respectful men that really appreciate their spouse or their partner. And it's a beautiful dynamic where they grow together, or in relationships where people didn't know themselves and they don't see their role in all of that. It can bring out the worst in people. Yeah. So our relationship can be one of the best tools to help us grow internally as well, or it can be something that is not so healthy. So discernment is really, really important.
Just if discernment was a light switch, wouldn't we all just flick it? It's like, I wish discernment was easier, but I think discernment, as I've already mentioned in the pod before, like discernment only comes from life experience. Like we have to have life experience that actually teaches us, that almost sharpens a sword. If our intuition was a sword that was able to cut through bullshit, we need life to sharpen it for us.
Yes.
Otherwise, we would all just have perfect discernment. You know, discernment and intuition are like brother and sister, I feel. Because intuition is like, and I remember there was a guy I interviewed named Gay Hendricks. He wrote a book called, what was that, about the glass ceiling, The Big Leap. And he said that most people, when they come across a situation, they'll just apply whatever glass ceiling or whatever limiting belief to that situation that is normal for them. And I even interviewed another guy named Scott Jackson. He's my mentor in neurolinguistic programming, which I'm fascinated by. It's the barrier between the subconscious and the unconscious mind, and how we unpack that and just live fully in our hearts. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? Just like fucking fully live in our hearts all the time. That'd be so beautiful. Yeah. But that barrier and the trauma that we've experienced, or as Gay Hendricks would say, the limiting belief that we put on our experiences, they blunt our discernment. They blunt our intuition. They actually kind of dull the sword that we have. And it's not really our fault that these things have happened again. Like, it's really not. Like, you didn't control your dad's behavior. That wasn't your fault. Mm-hmm. I didn't make my mom sick. Like, these aren't things that we did. But because of the neuroplasticity at age 0 through 7, and science is now proving this more and more and more, we actually, on an unconscious level, we believe that it was our fault. We believe that somewhere in your child mind, and whether you've gotten to this or not is not my business. That's your business. It's my business to know what I've gotten to. Somewhere in your child mind, there is a seed planted that something was your fault when it comes to your father or your mother. Somewhere in my child mind, in the deep recesses of my unconscious, I wonder, did my dad love me? Did my dad actually want me? Did my mom have me because she just wanted someone that loved her back? Like, these are the kind of questions that we really have to go deep into as a soul, so that we don't project those onto our partner. And, you know, it doesn't have, I know it's kind of a heavy conversation at times, but it doesn't have to be all work. Like, you know, the more honest that I can be with Carrie, and the more honest she is with me, like, about her brother and her father and her mother and her dynamics, the more she can express that to me, the more that it actually lightens the load between us. Because then it's like, you know, her kimono's open, my kimono's open. She can see all of my stuff. I can see all her stuff. The more of those conversations that we can have, the more conscious, that's really what it is. If you want a conscious relationship, conscious is when you make the unconscious and conscious one. That's really conscious. Otherwise, conscious is only 10% of relationships, 10% of being in relationships. So if you want a conscious relationship, you have to be willing to talk about the unconscious stuff that you don't even know you don't know. It's called unconscious incompetence. In order to be unconsciously competent, and there's a pathway to get there, you have to constantly go back to the well. And there is one more thing, if I can. I know I've gone off a little bit on your pod.
I love it.
Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
There is one more thing when it comes to discernment. You have to watch out for gaslighting specifically, because when you're, and I mentioned earlier, like, I don't know what it's like to be a woman and open up, you know, the beautiful fragility of a rose to a man. Like, that's a very sensitive thing, but it exists on both sides. It doesn't matter if it's male or female. When a partner is vulnerable and opens up to another partner, I see this a lot in the dynamic with men and women. Like, a woman will be really angry about something, and the man will go, oh, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. And she'll come back in for one more and like stab one more time. That's not okay. You can't do that. Like, and it works the other way too with men and women, vice versa. Man or woman, any partner that's like really come to the altar of humility and said, hey, you know what? I'm sorry. I can totally see how that upset you. Like, you know, as I reflect on that, here's the experience it brought up in me. And, you know, I'll be mindful of that next time. she or he can't come in one more time and say, yeah, you're an idiot, or yeah, you always do that. All that does is it takes away all the progress, and it actually unconsciously plants a seed in the mind of that partner that they never can open up to that person. Because when they finally do open up and they're vulnerable, they're then hit one more time with a sword. So we have to be very cautious of that. Like, when your partner is apologizing to you, man or woman, or when your partner is being vulnerable to you, feel your shit, feel your anger, and shut your mouth. And don't say anything else.
Definitely.
And that works both ways.
Yes. And the more that my former partner would be very honest with me, the safer I felt. But based on how he grew up, that would always be held over his head. And I wanted him to know, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm going to be so grateful that you're seeing your shit. I've got plenty of my own. So if anything, that makes me feel confident that we're both willing to do our part and grow, instead of what a lot of people fear. And I think a lot of people do what you just said. Someone will very vulnerably own their part and say where it's coming from, and that they're going to own it, and how they're going to shift from that and take responsibility. And then they're just met with more criticism. They're not going to feel safe to do that in the future. So we have to also check ourselves and say, are we creating a safe place for our partner to come to us with whatever that is? So that's beautiful to hear also. Okay, so one thing that I was going to ask you, but you kind of already answered it, is honesty always the best policy? Do you believe that would be?
Well, if we lived in a world where we were all vibrating at 700 or above, if you check the Hawkins scale, right? Then the answer would be unequivocally yes. But we live in a world where we're constantly floating up and down, all the way from the bottom, which is shame. Shame is the lowest human emotion vibration we can feel. Then apathy, then fear, then other things, till eventually we get to around 250, which is courage. But if we operated at 700 hertz, essentially 700 times that something moves per second on a vibratory level, then yes, if you have a partner where you're both doing the work, then eventually over time you will both vibrate at a higher level. And then yes, you can have honesty as the best measure. But there's also the way that honesty is said.
Right. Yeah.
Like the tonality, the words that are chosen. A lot of times, and I'll speak from a man's perspective, right? Like a lot of times men, they put themselves in traps. And I don't think that, and I'm speaking very generally right now. So if this is triggering anyone, I understand. I'm just speaking generally. I understand this isn't always the case, but generally, men, if they're not careful, can get into traps with women. This has been my experience where, women, a lot of times they will say what they feel, not exactly what they mean. And that's kind of the beauty of a woman, by the way, is like, if she was just like a man, there'd be no polarity. So we get to honor that part of a woman, but at the same time, it can really set a lot of traps, because when a woman asks a man a question, it's typically not always the question that she's wanting. It's something else. There's some other information that she's seeking on like an energetic level, and she may not even know what it is. She might just be talking to figure it out. A man has to be careful his pitch, his tonality, and the words that he uses when he answers the woman, even when it is, quote, with honesty.
Right.
Because if I was being honest, I would be driving a car and I would see somebody wearing 2 masks with their window rolled up, and I would say, what a fucking idiot. Well, is that really even though it's what I think is honest, is that really the best thing to say? No, it's not. And it's not very compassionate. So honesty is dependent on the level of compassion and awareness that you have. There's objective honesty, which is way above us. And then there's subjective honesty, which is always a fractal of our life experience. So no, honesty is not always the best policy.
Okay.
There's always times to withhold, because you need time to figure out if what you're about to share is the objective honesty that is going to be most loving in that situation, regardless of if you, quote, feel it or not. So for men need to be very cautious of this when they're answering questions from their woman, because, something said with the wrong pitch or wrong tone can actually exacerbate a situation 10 times more than if you were to just breathed, paused, and said, hey, babe, let me think about that.
Yeah.
I know you really want to know that right now. Honesty doesn't mean that you say it right away. Honesty sometimes can have patience before it. So that's the most mature answer to your question. is like, no, honesty is not always the best policy, but objective honesty blended with compassion and spaciousness, that absolutely is the best policy.
I love that distinction too. And some people will say, in not the most loving way, how they feel about someone. I'm just being honest. But
oh, I'm just speaking my truth.
Yes,
I'm just like,
different.
shut the fuck up. You can speak your truth without being a jerk.
Yes, I would agree with that. Sometimes it's better to pause and reflect, but to be honest from a place of compassion and not charged. I don't believe in problem solving when I'm in a charged state. Okay, so
that's beautiful. I agree.
Yes, that's a major
agree.
learning lesson, because nothing good comes out of it, and people go on the defense when they feel that charged energy. So I found it to be more productive to just sit with it. I will always be honest, but being honest once I'm in that grounded place.
Well, sometimes the most powerful, potent thing you can say from honesty is, hey, like for example, hey, Ashley, I'm really triggered by what you just said. I need about 15 minutes. You know, let's say we're in a relationship. I would say something like this. Hey, Ashley, what you just said really triggered the shit out of me. I need to go breathe. I need to be with myself for 10 minutes. I love you. Everything's okay. I'm not going anywhere. I just need some time on my own. Can I meet you back at this exact time?
Beautiful.
If you have the fortitude and the resilience to do that, you will diffuse 9 out of 10 blowups all the time.
Definitely.
But it's catching yourself. And the only way we can catch ourselves is if we I have to take a full deep nasal breath and a full belly to spine exhale. If I don't do that, it's, in my opinion, it's almost impossible to have that kind of regulation. It's just not possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for everything you shared. I have many more questions that I could ask you, but this has been great. So how can people find you, work with you? Can they work with you one-on-one? Or are you doing more offerings for the general public at this time?
Well, I thank you. Yeah, this is cool. It's a great podcast for your first one. I really love it. Is this going to be episode 001?
It may be.
Or you haven't figured it out yet?
I haven't figured it out. I'm getting it all recorded, but I think we can do that. Would you like that?
Whatever. It's your show. I'm just here to be a guest and to serve.
Yeah,
so the best.
It means so much. Yeah.
The best way that people can connect with me is the Wellness and Wisdom podcast. And so you can find that at joshtrent.com/podcast. Now, on a service level for breath, I do have a program that's a 3-week program that allows people to access the fundamentals of breath work, but it's not this airy-fairy woo, like way out there esoteric breath work program. It's actually something where if you've seen breath work, if you've been curious about breath work, if you want to use breath, which is your only voluntary and involuntary lever that you have that'll regulate your nervous system, just go to breathwork.io and use the code podcast30. That'll give you 30% off the program. It's at breathwork.io. And there I guide you for 3 weeks on how to actually use your breath to diffuse arguments, how to use your breath to calm yourself down. And there's 3 styles of breath that we didn't get into, but one is meditative, one is acute, and one is catharsis. So those 3 areas of breath is what we go over in the program. That's the best way to work with me in a model of group or even in a model of one-on-one. Okay. There is some opportunities to work with me one-on-one, but I ask that people go into that program first because typically they'll need that regardless if they work with me or not. And so breath is always the best starting place. So that's at breathwork.io.
Thank you. I will put all of those in the show notes. And it is so important for breath because a lot of the things that help us the most, there's no billboard for breath. There's no billboard for sunlight or living a circadian lifestyle. And nature has so many good things to offer us. And that's why, I am a hippie, but I also like to live in the modern world. But true health, in my opinion, and wellness come from living in alignment with nature. And we forget about just the most basic things like our breath. So thank you for helping people get back in tune with their bodies. That's something I'll check out too as I navigate this transitionary time in my life. So yeah, thank you for everything you've shared. I've taken a lot away from myself, and I hope this is very helpful for the audience as well. So thank you so much for your time and energy. It really means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, y'all, for listening.
Thank you for listening to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and leave a review, ideally a 5-star review if you loved it. All of this is free of charge and really helps me to be able to run the podcast. If you take a screenshot and tag me, I'll repost you and shout you out on Instagram. So tag Ashley Taylor Wellness and High Maintenance Hippie Podcast. If you have any feedback or guests that you'd like to have, I would love to hear from you so that I'm not just talking at you. I really want to deliver things that are valuable. So send me an email with any feedback, suggestions, or ideas for guests at ashley@ashleytaylorwellness.com. And I will leave you with a disclaimer. Please know that this is not medical advice or replacement for seeking medical care. Everything discussed on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Always consult with your medical provider before making any changes. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.